You are awake.
But the ground beneath you is moving.
Not the ground, actually. You realize this after a moment. It is the walls. Circular, built from bent wooden poles lashed together with rawhide, covered in thick pressed felt that breathes slightly with every gust. Above you is a round smoke hole open to a sky so full of stars it looks like something spilled. You are inside a jur, what the world outside will one day call a yurt, and the whole structure trembles very slightly, the way a living thing trembles when it breathes.
You are somewhere in the vast sea of grass that stretches from Manchuria in the east to the Carpathian Mountains in the west. A distance so enormous that the maps of your own time cannot adequately contain it. Historians will one day call this the Eurasian Steppe. The people who live here call it simply the world, because for them, it mostly is. Everything worth having is here. Grass for the horses, sky for navigation, wind for the spirit. Cities are curiosities. Walls are weakness. The horizon is home.
The year, if you could ask someone and receive an answer you understood, is somewhere in the early 13th century, and the name on everyone's lips, spoken with reverence or terror depending on which direction you have come from, is Temüjin.
You will come to know him as Genghis Khan.
Let's begin where the empire begins, not with a throne, with a boy abandoned.
Temüjin was born around 1162, somewhere near the Onan River in what is now northern Mongolia. His father Yasuge was a minor chieftain, not powerful, not wealthy by the standards of the steppe, but respected enough to have men who followed him and horses that were considered his and a camp that bore his name. When Temüjin was 9 years old, Yasuge took him east to find a bride from a neighboring clan, as was the custom when sons reached a certain age. The girl's family would keep the boy for a year before the marriage, and in that time, the two families would negotiate terms and exchange gifts, and the bond between clans would be formalized in the way these things were formalized. Not in writing, but in presence, in obligation, in the shared understanding that what was spoken at a fire was binding.
On the way home, Yasuge stopped to share food with a group of Tatars, traditional enemies of his clan, but the steppe had rules of hospitality that applied even between enemies, and he sat down with them. The Tatars poisoned him. Slowly enough that he made it back to camp, quickly enough that he died within days.
His widow, Holun, was left with 5 children and almost nothing else. The clan that had followed Yasuge, those warriors, those horses, those 40 families who owed him loyalty and counted on his protection, simply left. They did not stay to see the children fed. They took the horses and the cattle and the surplus food and they departed, and they did so without visible shame, because in steppe society, loyalty was not to a bloodline. It was to a living leader who could provide. A dead man's widow, however capable, was not a provider. She was a problem.
Holun fed her children by digging for roots along the river bank and hunting small animals with sticks. Temüjin learned to survive before he learned to lead. He learned what it felt like to be abandoned, to be nothing, to have the world simply continue without you, indifferent.
This matters. It matters deeply, because when Temüjin eventually built the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history, he structured it according to lessons learned in that abandonment. He forbade his commanders from ever leaving their wounded behind. He promoted men based on demonstrated merit and loyalty, not bloodline. He outlawed the kidnapping of women, which had been one of the steppe's most common causes of intertribal conflict for centuries. And he created a law code, the Yasa, that treated all people under Mongol sky according to the same rules regardless of tribe, origin, or religion.
He did not build the empire that hurt him. He built the opposite.
Now, Back to you in your jur before dawn.
Someone else is sleeping nearby. An older man wrapped in sheepskin, his face carrying the quality of permanent alertness that the steppe produces in people who survive long enough to grow old. Not hardened, exactly. Alive. Specifically, precisely alive, the way an animal that has been both predator and prey knows never to fully release its attention, even in sleep.
You should lie still. You should listen. Because surviving even 1 week in the Mongol world is not about physical strength, and it is not about luck. It is about understanding a set of rules so completely unlike anything you know that breaking them by accident, and you will break them by accident, is almost certain.
Rule 1. The horse is everything.
Not sacred in a religious sense, though religion will enter this later. Sacred the way air is sacred, the way water is sacred, the way water is sacred. You cannot function without it, and to damage or disrespect one is to endanger everyone around you. The average Mongol warrior owned between 5 and 10 horses, rotating them across long days, so no single animal was ever ridden to exhaustion. A warrior who burned through his horse was a warrior who arrived at the battle on foot, which was a warrior who arrived late or didn't arrive at all. A man who damaged a horse carelessly was worse than a thief. He was a liability. A man who could not ride was barely a man at all. And this is not cruelty. It is simple arithmetic. The steppe requires speed. Speed requires horses. Everything else descends from that single fact.
You cannot ride. Not properly. You can sit on a horse without falling off, probably, if the horse is cooperative and the ground is flat. But cooperative and flat are not conditions the steppe offers to visitors.
This is your first problem. Your second is the food.
Mongol diet on campaign, which is most of the year for most people, centers on 2 things: dried meat and fermented mare's milk called arag. The meat is pressed flat and dried until it is almost weightless, so dense in preserved protein that a warrior could carry enough calories for days in a pouch the size of a fist. It tastes of nothing you have a word for. Mineral, dense, intensely salty, with a texture closer to wood than anything you associate with eating. You eat it anyway, because the alternative is not eating.
The arag is sour, slightly alcoholic, and made by churning fermented mare's milk in a leather bag until it reaches a consistency between liquid and cloud. It smells in a way that takes several encounters to stop noticing. It is extremely good at keeping a man alive when there is nothing else. You will adapt to both, or your body will spend the rest of the week rejecting them. There is no third option. There is no alternative menu. The steppe does not have one.
The man sleeping nearby stirs, opens one eye, looks at you with calm, complete assessment. The kind of look that takes in everything useful in a single pass and makes no comment, and then closes his eye again. Outside, horses shift weight in the dark. The felt walls breathe.
You have survived the first night.
The camp wakes before full light. This is not a suggestion. It is the rhythm of steppe life, built around animals that must be moved to fresh grass before the dew burns off, water that must be fetched before competing camps claim the nearest source, and a military structure so deeply embedded in daily life that the 2 things are essentially the same thing. The Mongol army was not an institution separate from the people. It was the people organized. Every man between roughly 15 and 60 was a soldier. Every household was a logistics unit. The distinction between peacetime and wartime was primarily one of direction.
Genghis Khan formalized this by structuring his forces in what historians call the decimal system. 10 men formed an arban, a unit small enough to eat together, sleep together, and function as a single body in battle. 10 arbans formed a jagan, 100 men. 10 jagans formed a minghan, 1,000. 10 minghans formed a tumen, 10,000 fighting men under a single commander. Each level had a leader chosen for demonstrated ability, not birth. A man of no family, no horses, no land, could rise to command 10,000 soldiers if he proved himself capable.
This sounds obvious. In the 13th century, in a world where military command was hereditary everywhere from China to England, it was revolutionary.
You followed the old man outside into the cold.
The steppe in the early morning is a particular kind of beautiful. The grass runs in every direction without interruption, silver green in the low light, moving in slow waves when the wind passes through. Above, the sky is not just large, it is actively present, as if it is participating in whatever happens below it. The Mongols believed it was. Tengri, the eternal blue sky, was their primary deity. Not a god who lived in the sky itself, watching, judging, conferring victory on those whose actions deserved it. Genghis Khan claimed Tengri had chosen him. He believed this sincerely. In the logic of his world, success on the scale he had achieved had to mean something beyond human ability. The sky had moved through him. He was the instrument of a cosmic will that the sky had decided should express itself through conquest, through unification, through the elimination of the divisions that had cost the steppe generations of pointless blood.
You will hear his name spoken several times this morning, not as a historical figure, as a living fact.
The camp is maybe 60 families, perhaps 300 people in total, with their animals. They break it in under an hour.
This is the thing that visitors from sedentary civilizations always recorded with astonishment. The speed with which a Mongol camp simply disappeared. The gurs came apart in sections. First the felt, then the wooden lattice walls, then the central frame, each piece loaded onto wooden carts pulled by oxen. Each family was responsible for their own disassembly. Children who were old enough to walk were old enough to help. Children who were not old enough to walk rode in the carts between the bundles. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was left behind that could be taken.
The first Mongol general to meet a European army reportedly observed afterward that he had never encountered soldiers so slow. Not in the fighting, in the moving. European armies traveled with supply trains, baggage wagons, camp followers, farriers, surgeons, priests, cooks, and the accumulated logistical weight of people who had never imagined having to move an army across 1,000 miles in 30 days. Mongol armies traveled with themselves. Their supplies were on their horses. Their food was their horses in emergencies. They moved at the speed of the steppe, which was the speed of animals that had been bred for exactly this.
You climb onto a cart beside a woman who does not look at you and does not need to. The steppe begins sliding past you like a slow river.
By midday, you have covered more ground than you expected.
The land does not change, and this stops being strange and starts being hypnotic. The same grass, the same enormous sky, the occasional line of low hills in the distance that never seems to get closer no matter how long the cart moves. The woman beside you has fallen asleep sitting up, her body adjusting automatically to every jolt of the wheels, and you understand suddenly that she has done this her entire life. She was born in motion. The stopping is the strange part.
You think about distance.
The Mongol Empire at its height covered roughly 24 million square kilometers, larger than Africa, larger than any empire before or since. It stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Danube River in Eastern Europe, from the frozen steppes of Siberia to the shore of the Persian Gulf. It was not conquered by technology. The Mongols had no artillery, no gunpowder in significant quantity, no weapons that the Chinese or Persian or Russian armies they faced did not also possess. It was conquered by organization, by speed, and by a psychological strategy so effective that entire cities often surrendered before a Mongol force arrived, simply because of what they had heard about what happened to cities that did not.
Cities that surrendered peacefully were largely left alone. Administrators kept their positions. Trade continued. Taxes were collected at rates that were high, but crucially, predictable. A conquered city that submitted quickly was a city that remained useful, and useful things were not destroyed.
Cities that resisted were made into lessons.
The cart stops beside a shallow river in the afternoon.
The horses are led down to drink. Fires are built with practiced speed. The woman beside you hands you a piece of dried meat without looking at you, as if feeding travelers at water stops is simply a thing that happens, as ordinary as the river itself. You take it. You eat it. It is hard and dense and intensely salty, and it is the best thing you have eaten all day, which is the only standard that matters out here.
The old man from the chair sits near the fire. He looks at the river for a long time, the way men look at water on the steppe, not casually but with attention, reading something in the current, the color, the way the reeds lean, information that you don't have the vocabulary to receive.
After a while, he glances at the far bank. You follow his gaze.
On the far bank, perhaps 200 meters away, a line of riders has appeared. 20, maybe 30, sitting completely still on their horses, watching the camp. They carry bows. They do not advance. They do not retreat. They simply watch the way people watch who have time and certainty on their side.
The old man says something. The tone is not fear. It is closer to explanation. As if he is telling you, this is what happens out here. People appear, you assess them. They assess you. Most of the time, nothing more happens than that.
The riders eventually turn and disappear over a rise, as quietly as they came.
You are still here.
You have survived the first day.
But before you sleep, there is one more thing to understand about the world you have landed in. One more thing the steppe teaches that every other civilization of this era has forgotten or never learned.
The Mongol decimal system was not only a military structure, it was a social one. The Arban of 10 men was the smallest unit, and those 10 men were responsible for each other in a way that went beyond the battlefield. If one man deserted, his 9 companions answered for it. If one man committed a crime serious enough to warrant execution, the group could petition for a lesser punishment by offering to absorb it collectively. If one man died on campaign, his family was the responsibility of the remaining 9 until they could provide for themselves.
This is not welfare exactly. It is not charity. It is the recognition that on the steppe, where the margin between survival and failure is narrow, and the nearest help might be a day's ride away, the individual is not the fundamental unit. The group is. The group has always been. Every steppe people who survived long enough to leave a record understood this. Genghis Khan simply wrote it into law and scaled it up to cover an empire.
The old man is already asleep.
The fire is down to coals.
Outside, the steppe is making the sounds the steppe makes at night when no one is traveling it. The grass moving in long waves, the horses breathing. Something far away that might be an animal, or might be the wind through a particular shape of rock, carrying a sound almost like a voice.
Tomorrow, the camp moves again. Tonight, you listen to the steppe breathe. And you think about what it means to build an empire on the back of people who have never in their lives stood still.
Good night. For now.
It is the second night. You are learning things. You have learned that you do not approach another man's horse without being invited to. Not even to look at it admiringly. Because the horse is not a possession in the way your world uses that word. It is something closer to a partner. And you do not put your hands on a man's partner without permission. You have learned that the correct behavior upon entering a ger is to move to the right, sit where you are gestured to sit, accept whatever is offered before you are asked if you want it, and do not whistle inside the ger, because whistling inside a ger is, for reasons you cannot determine, deeply wrong. You have learned that the woman who sits to the left of the fire, which is always lit in the center of the ger, directly below the smoke hole, is the domestic authority of this household in a way that is not ceremonial. She is in charge of the food, the animals not on campaign, the management of the ger itself, and apparently of the old man's schedule in a way he seems to accept without resentment. You have also begun to understand why the empire is possible at all.
Let's talk about Temüjin again.
The standard telling of his story moves quickly from abandoned boy to conquering Khan, which is satisfying as narrative but skips the 30 years in between during which he assembled, through a combination of personal charisma, tactical genius, strategic patience, and the willingness to be absolutely ruthless when required. The coalition that would become an empire. Those 30 years are where you understand him.
By his early 20s, Temüjin had made his first alliances with the Karate tribe and their leader Togrul, who was something like his father's blood brother and who offered protection in exchange for loyalty and occasional military service. He spent years learning how larger tribal structures worked, how loyalty was built and destroyed, how information moved across the steppe, how a man with no horses could acquire horses, how a man with a few horses could acquire men, and how a man with men and horses and the right reputation could begin to pull the scattered and feuding tribes of the Mongolian plateau into something that had never existed before.
There were setbacks. He was captured by enemies and held in a wooden frame called a kang, a collar locked around his neck that prevented him from sleeping comfortably and announced his status as a prisoner to everyone who saw him. He escaped. He was betrayed by people he trusted. He was nearly killed in battle multiple times. His wife Borte was kidnapped by a rival tribe, the Merkits, who took her in retaliation for a kidnapping that Temüjin's father had committed a generation earlier. He got her back by mounting a military campaign with Togrul's help, and she returned pregnant with a son whose paternity was afterward never publicly questioned by Temüjin, which historians read as either profound trust or profound political intelligence, and possibly both.
In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai, held on the banks of the Onon River where he had grown up digging for food with his mother, the assembled chieftains of the unified Mongolian tribes gave Temüjin a new title.
Genghis Khan. The exact meaning is contested. Universal ruler. Oceanic ruler. His power spreading in all directions the way water does, filling every available space. Fierce ruler. The translations vary. The meaning is clear enough regardless of which word you choose. There is one sky. There will be one ruler under it.
Now here's the thing about Genghis Khan that the movies almost always miss, and the thing that makes him genuinely strange to think about.
He could not read. He never learned. He had no teachers in the years when learning was possible, and by the time he was powerful enough to demand them, he had already built his systems by other means. The Mongols used a writing system, borrowed from the Uyghur people, adapted for Mongolian, and applied to record-keeping, law, and official communication. But Genghis Khan dictated. Others wrote. His entire empire, all its laws and orders and correspondence with the kings of China and Persia and the Pope in Rome, all of it was spoken by him and set down by someone else.
What he had instead of literacy was memory. extraordinary, systematic, disciplined memory. He remembered the names and faces of subordinates he had met once years earlier. He remembered the exact terms of agreements made at verbal negotiations in the dark outside a fire. He remembered every betrayal, and just as precisely, every act of loyalty.
The loyalty is the part people underestimate.
Genghis Khan's inner circle contained men from conquered tribes, men who had been his enemies, men who had in some cases personally tried to kill him and failed. He did not always execute them. He offered a choice: submit completely, serve absolutely, and be rewarded as if you had always been his man. The past is the past. The steppe does not have room for endless grudges if you want to build something larger than a grudge.
His general Jebe had once shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him in battle. Deliberate shot, clean aim, the horse going down at the critical moment. When Jebe was captured afterward, he did not beg or lie. He admitted it plainly. He said, approximately, I was fighting for my people. Your horse fell. Now I am yours. Use me.
Genghis Khan made him one of his most trusted commanders.
A general named Subutai went on to conduct one of the greatest cavalry reconnaissance raids in military history. 20,000 men, crossing the Caucasus Mountains into Eastern Europe, routing the armies of Georgia, Armenia, the Cumans, the Volga Bulgars, and at the Battle of the Sit River, the Kievan Rus. Then looping back across the steppe to rejoin the main Mongol force. Having traveled roughly 5,000 miles through territory no Mongol army had ever seen. Scouting, essentially. The actual invasion would come later.
The army that did this was built from men who had been enemies. It was commanded by a man who had once tried to kill its supreme ruler. It ran on a system where demonstrated ability was rewarded regardless of origin.
The woman. You have been thinking of her as the one who knows, because that is the simplest accurate description of her role in this household, is sitting near the fire sharpening a small knife. The kind of knife kept in a leather sheath at the belt, used for everything from cutting meat to cutting rope, to the dozen unnamed small tasks that every day on the steppe requires. She sharpens it with the focused attention of someone maintaining a tool they depend on absolutely, which she is.
Mongol women in the 13th century occupied a position that would baffle and occasionally scandalize visitors from almost every other major civilization of the period.
They did not veil. They moved freely through the camp and between camps. They rode horses, not exclusively but routinely and well. They managed the household economy, which on the steppe was not a marginal role, but a substantial economic operation responsible for the gyr, the non-campaign animals, the children, the production and preservation of food, and the trading of surplus goods when merchants passed through. When husbands were absent, which was often, sometimes for years at a time, because the campaigns went very far, wives ran everything, not as deputies standing in for someone else, as the people in charge.
Genghis Khan's mother Holun, who had kept 5 children alive by digging roots from a riverbank, became a recognized political figure in the early empire. She was present at the Kurultai. She spoke. People listened, not as a courtesy extended to the mother of the great Khan, but because she had demonstrated over decades exactly what kind of mind she had. Genghis Khan's wife Berte was his primary advisor for decades. Her counsel was sought and, by most accounts, taken seriously on matters ranging from succession to military strategy.
Several Mongol women led armies. Several governed their territories independently. Teregani Khatun, wife of Ogedei Khan, governed the entire empire for 5 years between her husband's death and her son's election as Great Khan. The Persian and Chinese historians who recorded this do so without particular surprise. She governed. Decisions were made. The empire continued.
The one who knows finishes sharpening her knife.
puts it away, looks at the fire for a while, then looks at you directly with the same calm assessment she has given you since the first morning, and says something short. You do not understand the words. The tone is approximately, "You are still here. 2 days. This is noted."
You nod.
She looks back at the fire.
Before you sleep, think about what surrounds you.
The Mongol postal system, the Yam, was by the mid-13th century the fastest communication network on Earth. Relay stations spaced roughly 40 kilometers apart across the entire empire, each one stocked with fresh horses and provisions. A rider carrying an official message did not stop. He handed his message to the next rider at each station the way a baton passes in a race. And in this way, news could travel from China to Persia in weeks rather than months. Royal decrees could be distributed across the empire within days. A general in the field could receive orders from Karakorum and respond within a time that no other military force on Earth could match.
Marco Polo, traveling these roads in the 1270s under the protection of a golden tablet called a paisa, an all-access imperial passport issued in Kublai Khan's name, described the Yam stations with the detailed wonder of someone encountering something that worked better than anything in the world he came from. He had traveled routes where bandits had operated for generations and found them empty of bandits and full of the infrastructure of a state that took its roads seriously.
The Mongols did not build those roads for trade. They built them for armies. Trade followed, as it always follows wherever armies have made movements safe. And what moved along with the silk and the spices was everything else: ideas, diseases, technologies, people. The Silk Road had never been a single road. It was a network of routes, controlled at every junction by a different kingdom, taxed at every border, interrupted by every war. Under the Mongols, for the first time, it was controlled by a single power, from one end to the other.
The fire is almost out. The old man is already asleep. The one who knows is still. The horses are quiet somewhere in the dark outside.
One more thing before you sleep. The secret history of the Mongols is the oldest surviving work of Mongolian literature. It was written shortly after Genghis Khan's death, probably in 1228, and for centuries it was kept secret. The Chinese title under which it survived for hundreds of years translates roughly as the confidential history of the Yuan dynasty, implying it was not for general circulation, not for outsiders, perhaps not even for most Mongols. It was a record of the founding of the empire, told from the inside by people who had been there.
It begins with a genealogy. It moves through the stories of Temüjin's childhood, the abandonment, the survival, the first alliances, the betrayals and recoveries. It includes details so specific and so unflattering that no court historian making up a flattering origin story would have invented them. Temüjin and his half-brother murdered their father's first wife's son over a dispute about a bird and some fish they had caught. Temüjin was captured and held in that wooden kang and escaped by convincing his captor's son to help him. Berta's kidnapping is described plainly, including the uncertainty about her son's paternity.
A court chronicle wants its subjects to be gods. The secret history makes them human.
This matters because the empire it describes was built by humans. Real ones with specific childhoods and specific fears, and specific loyalties to specific people. The scale of what they created can make it feel abstract, inevitable, something that happened because of forces larger than individual people. But the secret history insists on the individuals. The boy by the river, digging for food. The man who shot the horse and became a general. The woman who kept 5 children alive and became a political figure.
All of this happened because of people. Specific, named, mortal people.
Consider Subutai.
Subutai Bater, Subutai the Valiant,
was, by most measures, the greatest military mind the Mongol Empire produced. He was born into a family of blacksmiths, not warriors. No bloodline claim on command, no horses of his own, nothing. He attached himself to Temüjin in his early years and rose through the decimal system on the basis of what he demonstrated. An ability to plan campaigns across geographical scales that no general of his era, and very few generals in all of recorded history, could match.
He fought in more than 65 battles. He conquered or defeated 32 different nations. He planned the invasion of Europe so carefully, with such detailed intelligence gathered over years, that the combined armies of Poland and Hungary were destroyed in 2 simultaneous battles fought on the same day, coordinated across hundreds of miles with no communication technology, faster than a horse.
He was, by the time of the European campaign, a very fat old man who was so heavy he could no longer ride into battle and had to be transported in a cart. He commanded from the cart. He won from the cart.
The Mongol system that promoted a blacksmith's son to supreme command of the world's most effective military force produced Subutai. It was not lucky. It was structural.
You have survived 2 days. A court chronicle wants its subjects to be gods. The secret history makes them human.
This matters because the empire it describes was built by humans. Real ones with specific childhoods and specific fears, and specific loyalties to specific people. The scale of what they created can make it feel abstract, inevitable, something that happened because of forces larger than individual people. But the secret history insists on the individuals. The boy by the river, digging for food. The man who shot the horse and became a general. The woman who kept 5 children alive and became a political figure.
All of this happened because of people. Specific, named, mortal people. You have survived 2 days.
Sleep now.
Good night.
3rd morning. Your body is adjusting to the airag. This is not a comfortable process, but it is a real one. And the fact that it is happening means you are adapting rather than failing, which on the steppe is the only distinction that matters.
You have learned something new this morning. Something you noticed yesterday but could not account for and have now found the words for. The old man navigates.
Not with a compass, not with a map. He navigates by reading the steppe in a way that takes in everything simultaneously. The color and height of the grass, the species of plants clustered near the path, the angle of the wind, the smell of the air, the direction of certain birds at certain times of day, the faint tracks left by other camps in seasons past. The steppe that looks empty to you is covered, for him, in text. He is literate in a language that has no alphabet, and he has been reading it since he could walk.
Today, a merchant arrives at camp.
He comes from the east, traveling with 2 Bactrian camels, the 2-humped kind, built for cold steppe winds rather than hot desert sands, and an assistant half his age who manages the animals while the merchant manages everything else. The cart behind the camels carries bolts of Chinese silk wrapped in oilskin against the weather. He speaks Mongolian with an accent that marks him as coming from Far East, perhaps from one of the sedentary peoples on the empire's Chinese frontier, and he is not nervous. He sits down at the fire as if he has done this 1,000 times, which he probably has, and he trades 2 bolts of silk for a collection of dried cheeses and a specific type of carved saddle fitting that the old man produces from inside the jar with the air of someone who knew someone would eventually want exactly this.
This is Pax Mongolica in its most ordinary form.
Let's talk about what the Empire looks like from the inside, at its height in approximately the Hormone 1250s.
The Great Khan, at this moment, is Mongol, grandson of Genghis, sitting in Karakoram. The Mongol capital built on the steppe in the Orkhon Valley, at Genghis Khan's command, a city that looked to visiting Europeans simultaneously impressive and deeply strange.
It had palaces, temples, markets, and a cosmopolitan population that included Chinese administrators, Persian merchants, Nestorian Christian monks, Tibetan Buddhist lamas, and craftspeople from a dozen conquered civilizations. At its center was a palace with a mechanical silver fountain designed by a French goldsmith named Guillaume Boucher, who had been captured during the Mongol invasion of Hungary, brought east across the entire breadth of the empire, and put to work because he was skilled and skilled people were assets.
The fountain dispensed wine, arig, honey mead, and rice wine simultaneously from 4 pipes, triggered by a silver angel at the top, who blew a horn when the great Khan called for drinks. Boucher built it. He was not a prisoner by the time he did so. He was a craftsman in imperial employ, living in Karakoram with his family, raising his children in the capital of the world's largest empire, because the Mongols had taken him east and then found him useful, and then simply kept him in the way you keep something useful.
This is the uncomfortable complexity of the Mongol Empire. It destroyed everything in the path of its conquest, and then hired the survivors to run things.
The Persian historian Ata Malik Juvaini wrote about the empire in the 1250s from the inside because he worked for the Mongol administration. He was well educated, from a family of administrators, and he survived the conquest of Persia by being useful. He eventually ran the administration of Baghdad for Hulagu Khan, the Mongol ruler of the Ilkhanate. He wrote the empire's history while working for the empire, which gives his account a quality that is hard to classify. Not quite propaganda, not quite criticism, something in between that shows a man trying to understand a power that had destroyed his world and then employed him.
He noted that Genghis Khan's religious policy was, by the standards of any civilization Juvaini knew, extraordinary. The Mongols had no strong institutional religion. Tengri, the sky, was the supreme force, and beyond that, individuals practiced what they practiced. Genghis Khan's own family contained practicing Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and shamanists, and he seems to have found this unremarkable. What he required was loyalty and function. What God you prayed to while being loyal and functional was your own business.
This was not tolerance in the modern sense, a principled commitment to the value of religious diversity. It was pragmatism so thoroughgoing that it produced the same results. The empire needed to govern dozens of peoples with dozens of religions, and choosing one religion and imposing it would have created resistance everywhere it was not already the local faith. Better to let everyone practice and require only that they pray for the great Khan's health while doing so. Which they did, because they were told to, and because the alternative was bad.
The merchant stays one night and leaves the next morning, continuing west. He carries a paisa, a passport tablet, silver in this case, indicating mid-level imperial authorization. With a silver paisa, he is entitled to fresh horses at yam stations, food and shelter at imperial rest stops, and the protection of Mongol law along any road in the empire. Anyone who robs him is robbing the empire, and the empire does not tolerate that.
Robbery of merchants on imperial roads was a capital offense under the Yasa. Not because Genghis Khan was sentimental about merchants. He was not, particularly, but because trade generated tax revenue and information, both of which were essential to running an empire of this size. And merchants were therefore assets, and damaging assets was a crime against the state. The logic was brutal, and the result was, for merchants, something close to safety.
The result was that the Silk Road, which had for centuries been fragmented, controlled at every junction by competing kingdoms that extracted what they could from every passing caravan, now functioned as a single highway across a single political entity, predictably taxed,
consistently protected. Moving continuously, carrying everything.
What moved with the silk was everything else.
Papermaking had been a Chinese technology since the 1st century. Under the Pax Mongolica, it traveled west across the empire and entered the Islamic world and eventually Europe, where it would make books cheap enough to print in quantity. Printing with movable type, also Chinese, also ancient by this point, traveled the same route. The magnetic compass, developed in China for geomancy and then adapted for navigation, moved west along the Silk Road. Gunpowder had been a Chinese military technology since the 9th century, and Mongol armies had used Chinese engineers and their weapons in their western campaigns, and now the knowledge was loose in the world in a way it could not be recalled.
The Mongols did not carry these things west as policy. They were simply running an empire, and empires with open roads have open roads, and ideas travel on open roads whether anyone intends them to or not. The Renaissance that would transform Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries would draw on papermaking, printing, new mathematical ideas from the Islamic world, and the reopened trade routes that made the wealth of China and India and Persia suddenly accessible again.
All of it moving along roads the Mongols had made safe by conquering everyone who lived near them.
That afternoon, a dispute.
2 men, younger than the old man, arguing about a horse. The animal was borrowed and returned with a strained leg, favoring it slightly. And both men know exactly what this means, and what the rules are, and what the right outcome is. And they disagree about which of those things applies here. The argument is conducted with the controlled intensity of people who understand that what they are negotiating is not just this one horse, but the terms of every future transaction between their families.
A neutral elder is called. He listens to both men, asks questions, examines the horse's leg carefully, running his hands down it with the expertise of someone who has assessed 1,000 such injuries, makes a judgment. Both men accept it without visible resentment, because the judgment was made by a process they recognize as legitimate, and a legitimate process they lose to is better than an illegitimate process they win.
Toyasa addressed injured borrowed animals specifically. He'd addressed dozens of situations that a sedentary law code might have thought beneath formal regulation. The obligations between horsemen, the treatment of animals, the management of shared water sources, the conduct of men on the road between camps. It addressed them because these were the things the steppe cared about, and law codes reflect what civilizations care about.
That evening, the old man tells a story.
He tells it by the fire, the way stories are told on the steppe, with repetition, with changes in voice for different characters, with pauses that the audience fills in because they have heard the story before and know where the pauses fall. At some point, everyone laughs briefly. The old man catches your eye and says something that includes you, not explaining the joke, but acknowledging that you are there, present, listening even without understanding. A visitor, a witness.
You nod.
He nods back.
There is a Mongol concept that does not translate cleanly into any Western language. The idea of Nutag. It means approximately homeland, but not homeland as a fixed place. Homeland as a relationship between a person and a particular section of steppe that their family has used for generations. The grass where your grandfather grazed his horses, the river where your mother filled water bags, the particular slope of hills on the eastern horizon that you have been looking at your entire life from the same angle.
You cannot own Nutage. You cannot buy it or sell it or divide it with walls. But it is yours, in the sense that matters on the steppe. It is the place that knows you, the place that your animals know, the place that your body knows the way a body knows its own bed after years of sleeping in it. Moving away from Nutag was, for the Mongols, a kind of grief. Moving toward it was a kind of homecoming that required no ceremony because the land itself
was the ceremony?
Genghis Khan, who spent his entire reign moving away from the Onan River of his childhood, reportedly asked that his body be returned to the place he was born. The unmarked grave somewhere in northern Mongolia, the location of which has been kept secret for 800 years, is presumably in his nutage, in the grass that knew him when he was a boy with nothing.
The same open roads that carried silk and paper and printing, and the compass west also carried something else.
The plague bacterium Yersinia pestis had existed in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe for centuries, probably millennia. It was endemic there, part of the landscape, like the grass and the wind, and the people who lived with it had, over generations, developed partial immunities or cultural practices that limited exposure. The bacterium did not need to travel, because the rodents that carried it did not need to travel. The steppe had always been home enough.
The Silk Road changed this. Merchants, soldiers, and their pack animals created a network of contact that the bacterium could follow. By the 1330s and 1340s, Yersinia pestis was moving west along the Mongol trade routes in rat fleas on the backs of rats in the caravans that the Pax Mongolica had made viable. By 1346, it was in the Crimea. By 1347, it was in Sicily. By 1350, it had killed approximately a third of Europe's population.
The trade network that had carried the Renaissance west also carried the Black Death west. The same roads, the same conditions, the same open passage that Genghis Khan's law had protected for merchants and pilgrims and diplomats, protected, without distinction, anything small enough to travel without a paisa.
The fire dies down.
Somewhere to the west, in cities that do not yet know what is coming, people are going to sleep under roofs of stone and wood and tile, in beds, in rooms with walls that do not breathe. They will wake tomorrow in the same place they fell asleep. They will cook in the same kitchen and walk the same streets. The fixity of their lives is so complete they have stopped noticing it.
You have been sleeping in a structure that moves with the wind, in a world that moves every morning, among people who have been in motion since before memory. And you are beginning to understand that the steppe does not suffer from the absence of walls. The steppe was never supposed to have walls. The walls are the accommodation. The motion is the original condition.
Somewhere to the west in the courts of Europe, scholars are writing about the Mongols with a horror that mixes with fascination in a ratio that shifts, depending on how recently the armies passed through. The Tartars, they call them. A pun on Tartarus, the underworld, because these people seem to erupt from the earth itself. They have devastated Poland and Hungary within living memory. They have ridden to the Adriatic coast and stood looking at the sea with apparent surprise, then turned back.
The Europeans do not know why they turned back. They believe they were saved by their own resistance or by divine intervention, and both explanations feel more comfortable than the true one, which is that the great Khan Ogedei died in Karakorum while his generals were standing at the Adriatic, and all Mongol commanders were required to return to the Kurultai to choose a successor. Europe was spared further invasion, not by anything Europe did, but by the death of a man on the other side of the world who liked to drink.
They turned back, and the fear they left behind became, over the next century, the foundational anxiety of the European imagination, that something could come from outside, from beyond the edge of the known, and there was nothing to stop it.
They were not wrong about that part.
Good night. Something has changed.
You feel it before you understand it. The camp which has moved every morning is not moving today. The old man is sitting outside the ger before full light, wrapped in his sheepskin looking east. Not watching for anything, watching towards something. The distinction is in his posture, the released quality of it, the absence of alertness. He is waiting for the sunrise the way a man waits for something he has been waiting for every day of his life, without ever becoming used to it. You sit beside him.
The horizon goes from black to deep blue, to a color that exists only in this moment, only on the steppe, only before the sun arrives. A kind of cold violet that the sky holds for perhaps 30 seconds before it releases into gold. The stars disappear one by one from the west and hold longer in the east. A line of light appears.
Neither of you says anything.
Let's talk about what ends empires.
Genghis Khan died in 1227. The cause remains uncertain. A fall from a horse is the most consistent account, possibly compounded by an infection or internal injury that a man of his age could not recover from. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, which was genuinely old for a man who had spent his entire adult life sleeping in felt tents and riding to wars. He died on campaign, in the field, finishing the conquest of the Xia dynasty of northwestern China. He left instructions that his death be kept secret until the campaign concluded and the Xia were finished. His body was carried home wrapped in felt, and if anyone along the route noticed something wrong, they did not say so.
No one knows where his tomb is.
He requested, reportedly, an unmarked grave. After the burial, the soldiers rode their horses over the ground until no disturbance of the earth was visible. Some accounts say trees were planted. Some say the mourners were killed afterward to preserve the secret. Whatever happened, the landscape absorbed him, and he has not been found.
He had spent his life building something visible across the entire world. He ended it in anonymous ground.
The empire he left behind was divided among his sons according to steppe tradition, not to a single heir, but distributed, each major son receiving a territory and a title. This had functioned adequately for smaller holdings for generations. For an empire of 24 million square kilometers, it introduced the structural tension that would, within 2 generations, pull everything apart.
The sons cooperated, mostly under a great Khan who held nominal supremacy. Genghis Khan's third son, Ögedei, became the first great Khan, and under him the conquests continued. Russia, Poland, Hungary, Persia, the Song dynasty in China. Ögedei was by most accounts a capable administrator and a severe alcoholic, and the alcoholism eventually killed him in 1241. His wife Turagain governed for 5 years while the empire argued about who came next.
Then Guk briefly, then Munka. And then after Munka died of cholera in 1259 during the campaign against the Song dynasty, the fault lines that had been held together by personality and habit and the memory of Genghis Khan finally gave way. Munga's brothers Kublai and Arik Boka both claimed the title of Great Khan. Both held Kurultais. Both were declared the legitimate successor by their respective supporters. They fought a civil war, and Kublai won, and the winning broke the empire into 4 Khanats that were from that point on, as often at war with each other as with anyone outside.
The individual pieces survived for varying lengths of time.
The Golden Horde in Russia lasted, in various forms, until the late 15th century, when the Grand Duchy of Moscow finally shook off its obligations to the Khan. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed in 1335, dissolving into competing successor states when the last Ilkhan died without an heir. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia fragmented and reformed and fragmented again, fading gradually over the course of the 14th century. The Yuan dynasty in China, Kublai Khan's empire, the most sophisticated of the 4, with a capital at Khanbalik that Marco Polo described as the greatest city in the world, fell in 1368 to a peasant uprising that founded the Ming dynasty.
The Ming had been subjects of the Yuan for most of a century. They knew exactly what had conquered their predecessors' world. Their first act of major construction was the Great Wall of China in its current form. Not the ancient earthworks of the Warring States period, but the stone and brick wall that still stands, built explicitly, systematically, to prevent another army from riding out of the steppe and doing what the Mongols had done.
The Ming had been subjects of the Yuan for most of a century. They knew exactly what had conquered their predecessors' world. Their first act of major construction was the Great Wall of China in its current form. Not the ancient earthworks of the Warring States period, but the stone and brick wall that still stands, built explicitly, systematically, to prevent another army from riding out of the steppe and doing what the Mongols had done. They built it against a memory.
Kublai Khan deserves a moment here, because he is the last great unifying figure of the Mongol story, and because his empire was in many ways unlike anything his grandfather had imagined or intended. Kublai ruled from Khanbalik, the city that Marco Polo described in terms so extravagant that Europeans assumed for centuries he was lying or confused. He was neither. Khanbalik was, in the 1270s and 1280s, probably the largest and most sophisticated city in the world. Its streets were laid out in a grid. Its markets sold goods from China, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean. Its postal system could deliver a message from the capital to the southern coast in a matter of days. Its treasury contained wealth on a scale that no European court could have comprehended. Kublai was also by the measures his grandfather would have recognized in the process of losing himself. He adopted Chinese court customs. He moved from Karakorum to Khanbalik. He ate Chinese food and employed Chinese administrators and governed increasingly like a Chinese emperor. The Mongols who remained on the steppe looked at him and saw a man who had been swallowed by what he ruled.
They were not wrong. Kublai Khan was the last great Khan anyone took seriously, and he spent the last decades of his life watching the empire his grandfather had built dissolve into its component parts, while he governed the most magnificent fragment of it and called it the whole.
Marco Polo arrived at Kublai's court in 1275 and stayed for 17 years. He learned Mongolian and possibly Chinese. He served in Kublai's administration, traveling to provinces so remote that no European had set foot in them. When he finally returned to Venice and was captured in a war with Genoa and wrote his account of what he had seen while imprisoned, his cellmate Rusticello of Pisa helped him shape it into a book.
Europeans rate it as fantasy. Palaces with walls tiled in silver. Roads lined with trees so travelers could find their way in snow. Coal, which they burned in China, Marco Polo reported. Europeans burned wood and did not believe him. Black stones dug from mountains that burned like logs. Paper money backed by the authority of the Khan. Hand over paper, receive goods. Impossible. All of it was true.
The book was called in its time Sevel Milioni, the million, not as a compliment, as a joke. That man and his million lies. He died in 1324 maintaining that he had told the truth, and reportedly said on his deathbed that he had not told half of what he had actually seen.
He probably had not.
And then there was Baghdad.
This deserves its own moment, because it is the moment in the Empire's history that still resists clean accounting. The moment historians return to when they want to confront what the Mongols actually were, at their most absolute.
In 1258, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, brother of Kublai and Munga, arrived outside the walls of Baghdad with a Mongol army and the allies that the Mongol system of conquest had accumulated: Georgian cavalry, Armenian infantry, Nestorian Christian soldiers fighting alongside the Buddhist and Shamanist Mongols, united by the logic of the empire that had absorbed them all. He sent a message to the Caliph al-Mustasim, demanding surrender.
Baghdad was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed since 750 AD. It was the spiritual center of the Sunni Islamic world, and the political center of the Arab civilization that had, for 5 centuries, produced some of the greatest mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and literature in human history. The city had a population of perhaps 1 million people. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, had for centuries been accumulating, translating, and expanding the knowledge of the ancient world, taking the philosophy of Greece and the mathematics of India and the astronomy of Persia, and adding to all of it the innovations of Arab scholars who were, by any measure, producing the most sophisticated scientific culture on earth.
The Caliph refused to surrender.
What happened next lasted 13 days.
The walls were breached on the 10th of February. The killing went on for days after that. The estimates range from 100,000 dead to 800,000, and the true number is probably unknowable. The Caliph was captured. His treasuries were opened and the contents taken. The House of Wisdom's libraries were carried to the river and thrown in.
The Tigris ran black with ink, the Arab historians wrote. Then it ran red.
The Caliph was executed. The method, reportedly, was wrapping him in felt and trampling him to death with horses. The Mongols had a practice of not spilling royal blood directly on the ground, and they applied it here. Felt, the same material as the walls of every jur you have slept in this week, wrapped around the last Abbasid Caliph, and the horses ran over him until he was gone.
The caliphate that had lasted 500 years ended in an afternoon.
Historians debate what was lost in Baghdad in 1258. They are right to debate it, because the story is genuinely complicated. Many manuscripts had already been copied and distributed to libraries across the Islamic world before the sack. Some of what would have been destroyed on religious grounds was actually preserved, because Hulagu's Nestorian Christian wife intervened for certain works. The Persian administrative tradition survived because the Mongols needed administrators, and the Persians, who knew how to administrate, survived by being useful. The Islamic Golden Age did not end on a single February day.
But the physical libraries went into the river. The city that had been the largest in the world was reduced, in population and wealth and infrastructure, to a fraction of what it had been. The Abbasid Caliphate, the symbolic center of an entire civilization's political identity, was gone, and it did not come back. The political unity of the Sunni Islamic world, fragile as it had been, ended in 1258 and has not been restored.
Some losses are losses, even when the accounting is complicated.
The old man beside you in the growing light begins to speak.
He speaks quietly, without looking at you, for a long time. The rhythm is that of someone recounting something serious and true, not performing it, not dramatizing it, just placing it in the air between you as a fact that should exist somewhere outside one person's memory. You understand none of the words. You understand everything about the tone.
When he finishes, he looks at the horizon.
The sky is fully light. The stars are gone. The steppe runs gold-green to every edge of vision.
Here is what the Mongol Empire was.
The largest land empire in history. 24 million square kilometers. The only power ever to unite China and Persia and Russia and Central Asia under a single administration. It destroyed cities that have not recovered their former stature to this day. It protected and enriched others for generations. It carried plague along the trade routes it made safe, and that plague became the Black Death that killed a third of Europe. It carried paper making and printing and the compass, which became the foundations of the Renaissance. It killed, by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere between 30 and 40 million people in conquest. Roughly 10% of the world's population at the time. It then maintained, for roughly 60 years, the safest international trade network humanity had ever produced.
It was not good. It was not evil. It was enormous, and it happened. And almost everything that came after it happened differently because of it. You have been here 1 week. You have not lasted well by the standards of this world. You cannot ride properly. You cannot read the grass. You cannot speak a single word of the language that is spoken around you every hour of every day. You would not survive a winter on the steppe,
or a season on campaign, or the 100 small emergencies that people here navigate without noticing because they have navigated them every day since they were old enough to walk.
But you are here.
You have eaten and slept, then watched and listened. The old man has not turned you out. The one who knows has handed you food at rivers. The merchant who passed through looked at you once and decided you were probably harmless and continued west. The horse dispute was resolved without involving you, which means you were not a complication, which on the steppe is a successful outcome.
You have survived your week, not because you were strong, because you were quiet, because you watched instead of assuming, because you did not pretend to understand what you did not understand, which is the beginning of survival in any world, and particularly this one.
The comp is breaking around you. The jar comes apart in its sections. The felt, the lattice, the frame. And it loads onto the cart in the order it will need to come off. The oxen are hitched. The horses are assembled. The old man mounts with the ease of a man who has not spent a single day of his life not knowing how to do this. And he looks down at you for a moment. And he says something with the flat, calm certainty of someone stating a simple truth about the world.
You don't know what it means.
But the tone is, you are still here. The sky is still there. The grass still runs to the horizon. We are moving.
You climb into the cart.
The steppe begins sliding past you again.
The Mongol Empire is moving.
Still, at this moment in the 13th century, in motion, expanding, administering, carrying knowledge and plague and silken horses from one edge of the world to the other. The khanates that will divide it do not exist yet. The Black Death has not yet followed the trade routes west. Marco Polo has not yet walked through Karakorum and tried to describe it to an Italy that will not believe him. The Ming Wall is not yet built. The last Abbasid Caliph is still alive in Baghdad.
All of that is still ahead.
Right now, there is only the steppe and the sky and the horses and the motion. And you are part of it, briefly. The way a leaf carried on a river is briefly part of a river. Present, moving, real, and then gone, and the river continues.
The horizon does not get closer. The grass does not end. The sky watches, as it has always watched, as it will watch long after the empire is dust and memory, and the subject of sleep histories told in languages that do not yet exist.
Good night, good night.